while 22 Irish players are involved as the new AFLW season gets underway this coming weekend. Delighted to say that we're joined by Maurice Brosnan of the 42.ie. Maurice, how are you getting on?
Great, Will you? How about yourself?
Yeah, could we start maybe about the contract situation? Because you've been writing about this a little bit, and the aforementioned Zach Tuohy, who is closing in at this stage rapidly on Jim Stein's record, and potentially Geelong might finally give him a premiership medal at the age of 32. But it would seem, based on some of the local reports in Melbourne, that he will be staying at Geelong beyond the end of this contract, which is running down currently.
Yeah, it's funny. Well, if you had asked me to talk to you about this time last year, I probably would have. And you'd asked me about that Jim Stein's record or an Irish player winning a premiership. I would have said not in a long time. I don't see it happening in the next couple of years. And if you're going to ask me today, I think we have a good chance of both happening. In terms of Zach getting another year, in one sense, it's probably not actually a surprise. Geelong would be known as a club. Critics would kind of call him nearly an old folks' home, disparagingly, because of the amount of players they have who are over 30. Now, in saying that, they're also a club who defy the yo-yo nature of AFL with the draft, and partly that is because of the fact that they hold on to their experienced players and get the most out of them. So, as you look at his performances this year, they've been absolutely phenomenal. It's kind of remarkable how, once again, this guy who I think even he would admit it himself, he wasn't sure if he was going to play beyond this year, has been just an absolute stalwart for them again. So yeah, it looks like, at least according to the Geelong Advertiser, he's going to have another year deal. Mark O'Connor probably hasn't had as good a year, I would say, this year, but he still is. He's still playing every week. The two boys are playing every week. They will be heavily involved. That, as you mentioned, that's a qualifying final. So even if they lose that, they're not actually out. The fact that they tops the Premiership gives them that small bit of leeway. But in terms of from a contract position, they're both going to be there. They're both right in the reckoning. I think they have as good a chance as they probably ever have had of winning a premiership. Right now, they kind of be my shout, to be honest.
Once upon a time, Zach Tuohy used to talk about potentially when he got to 32, 33, he might consider his future in Australia, potentially come home and play for Laois for a few years because of the young nature of when he went across. He was signed at 17 and went across when he turned 18 to Australia, and he's been there ever since. He never got the chance to play for the Laois senior football team. I think hopes of that are probably fading for Laois supporters at this stage, because last week he tied the knot with his long-term partner. He's potentially now going to sign at least one more year with Geelong at this stage. I think it's probably unlikely we'll see him play Gaelic football now unless it's into his mid-30s. Yeah,
yes and no, I would say, Will. I think if you ask Zach, I would say he still is open to the idea of coming back to Port Laois whenever he does retire. Now, obviously, as you mentioned, that would be in his mid-30s if that does happen. I would just say, too, that I would, he mentioned that a lot, but as you mentioned, he went over there when he was 17, 18, went to Carlton, and that didn't end the way, you talk to Carlton supporters now, and they will still bemoan the fact that they let Zach Tuohy go with what was perceived by many to be kind of an insulting offer, in a sense, a contract offer. And, again, going back to this idea of Geelong, they would be very big on culture and their team buy-in, and whether you believe that or not, one man who does absolutely believe that is Zach Tuohy. He is just loyal to a fault. I know I spent some time with him in Geelong last year. He swears and dies by that club and his teammates. So I think as long as they want him around, he will be there, which I guess is unfortunate for Laois and for Port Laois.
Yeah, we'll talk about the amount of female Irish players who've gone across, 22 this season, which is quite remarkable, in a few minutes. But pretty much every player I've spoken to who has gone out to Australia, and not necessarily going to the same club. I know he was very important to O'Connor when he went into Geelong, but Tuohy seems to be really important as somebody to make contact with when players sign and go over to Australia. He's helped a lot of these lads out along the way.
He has, and it's partly because sometimes I find it funny when you hear players talking about the issues they encountered, or whether that be homesickness or the difficulties that would kind of naturally happen when you go to Australia. And the thing is, Zach also undergone all of that stuff, and he just persevered through it. He's the ultimate. He's really a testament to persistence and resilience, really. He got off a plane and he was straight away thrown in to do the 2K tan, which is an absolute grueling run, and no bother. And from then on, he just puts the shoulder to the wheel, gets to work. I think that he would be. He actually is respected in that regard, not just by Irish players, but actually by Australians as well. So it's only natural that he would be kind of a natural sounding board for players going over there. And also, as you mentioned, it's kind of ironic. And maybe Zach won't like me for this. I wouldn't have seen him getting to Stein's record right up until this year, but he just continues to defy, I guess, my measly expectations. And he will become, I think, the greatest Irish player we've ever seen in the AFL. I think a premiership would absolutely crown that if they were to get that this year.
Yeah, and how important would a premiership be if he's to be remembered like some of the Irish players who've got their hands on a premiership medal? Is that needed as part of the collection?
It's a great question, Will. And I remember I actually asked Zach this last year, and he he told me that if he doesn't, and this, you got to think about this. Like, this guy's played 246 games in the AFL. He's playing for one of the best teams in the league. He's playing week in, week out. He's a star. He probably should have got an All-Australian a couple of years ago. And when I asked him about winning a premiership, he told me that he would view his career as a failure if he doesn't get a premiership. Now, this is a guy who's, other than Jim Sainz, nobody's come close to what this guy has achieved. And even still, so to his mind, regardless of the perception, to my mind, it doesn't really, I would kind of roll my eyes, to be honest, at the counting medals and that being a testament to somebody's career. Like, you could probably have to do a bit more analysis of it, but to his mind anyway, it certainly is a huge deal. So as long as Zach is around, he is absolutely determined to get a premiership. And as I mentioned, I do think this is as good a chance as they had ever. Like, you look at you could poke holes in a lot of teams in the top 8 this year, whereas Geelong are coming into this off the back of a 13-game winning streak. Like, they're in red hot form.
Can you explain to me why the game against Collingwood then will be at the MCG? Because surely if you top the ladder, you should get home advantage.
Yeah, that's a good question, and you would think so too. GmbH Stadium in Geelong is a smaller stadium. It's an absolutely brilliant stadium. I'd highly recommend anybody to try and get down there. You're right on top of the ground. It's really tight, but when you can get, close to twice as big a crowd into a ground, it's probably only natural that, and technically, you could probably make the case that, which, again, is a stretched case because Collingwood are a Melbourne club too, but Geelong isn't that far from from Melbourne. So I guess that's the justification for it. It's a hard one to necessarily wrap your head around, and I'm sure Geelong's record as well at home is brilliant too. But again, as I said, it's probably because of the nature of the ground and the fact that they are just a really strong team anyway. Yeah,
I always find it entertaining that Australians, you had your time out there as well, they kind of see distances slightly different to us, where in Geelong it's like, I live about 40-50 k's outside Melbourne, I'm just outside the town, while in Ireland that is seen as a significant distance.
Yeah, so it's a normal thing to drive 2 hours just to go for dinner. It was a hard thing to get my head around when I was out there. All right.
Colin O'Riordan, how's he getting on at Sydney? Because a couple of years ago we saw him play a pretty crucial role when he was back home during the pandemic with Tipperary. I think he says a year left in his contract, does he, Maurice, at this stage?
He's actually out of contract at the end of this year, Will. Sometimes people ask me about my experiences in Australia, and one of my main takeaways was just how an impressive kind of athlete or teammate Colin O'Riordan is. Like, people just absolutely swear by him. He is so popular. I was not one bit surprised when he won Best Clubman last year. He's enjoyed just a nightmare year. Like, it's cruel in a sense that when you look at last year, and this is a guy who got caught up in, I don't know if you remember, a couple of the Irish players attended Australia versus France rugby game, and because of Melbourne's kind of, some would deem very strict COVID rules, he was deemed as a contact and ended up, because he crossed out of the state afterwards, he ended up missing weeks of action. And he comes back this year and again, looks like he's going to nail down a spot in the back line. Is playing incredible stuff in the VFL, like regularly getting more than 30 disposals, and early in the season gets a freak injury. He gets poked in the eye. I did lasting damage. I think he still had, weeks later, he still had visible damage to his eye. So he was ruled out, obviously, with that, re-monitoring that. Comes back in, forces his way back in, despite the fact that he's probably Sydney were in pretty decent form at the time, but he was out of action. But manages to force his way back in, plays 5 games, gets a concussion, persists through that, and then a long-standing hip and groin injury flares up and just grinds into an absolute halt. For weeks and weeks he wasn't even able to run. The latest updates from the clubs is that he's not going to play this year. They actually are in the 8, and he was. You go back to this time last year, he was playing in the finals for Sydney, so he would be a good bet to play if he was fit. But unfortunately, he's not fit, and it's coming at just a really cool time. Will, you got to think about this: a guy who's trying to earn another year on his contract, who is contributing absolutely off the field and will always do so. But he would, when you talk to him, he has got just this relentless determination to prove it on the field, and for one reason or the other, he's not able to do that now. So it's just, you have to feel for a guy like that, a guy who, again, as I go back to, he's just one of the tough-nosed people. He's a guy, I think Zach Tuohy, as it happens, has mentioned to me a couple of times that Colin is a guy he would love to play with because of just his hard-nosed nature, shoulder to the wheel. He does not believe in the idea of born talent. This guy is about absolute graft every single day, and for right now he can't prove it on the field, which I guess must be just heartbreaking, really.
Yeah, it's difficult when you're in the middle of negotiating time as well. He'll probably be hoping though that maybe his body of work at the club, and given how highly regarded he's been at the Swans as well, that will perhaps influence them to offer a new deal in the coming weeks.
Absolutely, and also he's proven, and this is a big thing I think for Irish player. He has proven AFL quality, as in terms of he's been out there and done that. For a lot of these other guys who are nearing the end of their deals, there's a couple of guys now who are approaching that kind of business end of the season, but a lot of these guys haven't actually played yet, so they haven't made their debut, is what I mean. So they're a list manager is looking at this and they're adjudicating based on their ceiling, whereas you're looking at a proven body of work with somebody like Colin, and on top of all that, you've got the contribution he makes around the club, which is just, I really can't stress that enough. It's, anytime you talk to anybody in Sydney, the one guy they go back to is Colin O'Riordan. Even unprompted, Mark Gallen, who's actually back in Ireland now, he's a strength and conditioning coach in Sydney last year, just absolutely raves about Colin O'Riordan. I spoke to Barry O'Connor recently, the same thing again. He can't speak highly enough of him. So I think all that on top of it all would strengthen his case, absolutely.
Yeah, I was reading your piece in the 42.ie a couple of days ago, and you were mentioning even about Barry O'Connor and some of the other players. It's so difficult for these guys, even when they go over there, to say compete at VFL level first of all, to try and impress, and then to get into the first team, which maybe just when we talk about Jim Stein's record and what Tuohy's doing at the moment, even if you go over there with remarkable talent and you've been scouted over here, it's a difficult thing to actually break into the AFL first team squad.
Yeah, you have to hit the nail on the head there, Will. And one thing I kind of stress about when you're looking at this from the outside looking in, and this, the only reason I kind of stress this is because this would have been my misconception when I looked at players who maybe come back, and I would have never bought into this, but sometimes they themselves would kind of buy into the idea that they were deemed a failure because they didn't play in the AFL. And then you talk to clubs about, and I would pose the question, what actually went wrong? And frequently they would come back and say, oh, this guy absolutely was good enough to play in the AFL. Like, he absolutely, we could have played him and he could have played 5-10 games, but when we're going for an Irish player, when we want to invest all this in, and when you sign an Irish player, let's say right now, for example, there's clubs scouring Ireland, and they'll probably sign a player or two at the end of this offseason, and they'll be a Category B rookie, which means they sit outside the salary cap. So you've got 45 players, every team has got a salary cap, but these players are outside that. So you could deem that a free hit, really, because they're not going to take from your salary cap. But if you're doing that, it's obviously there's a cost associated with that, and you want to invest a lot of resources into them. So when you're doing that, if you sign a lot of these clubs would look at a guy and say, we don't want this guy to play 10 games. We want him to be able to play 100 games. And if he can't do that, we're going to try and find another guy to do exactly that. So that's why you see players come back, really talented players. And you're looking at it and think, this guy, he didn't play a game in the AFL. And he was capable. He was absolutely capable of playing. And the club will tell you that. But what they want is a guy who can play 100 games or more. They need somebody who's, a Conor McKenna, a real point of difference. Zach Tuohy is a classic case example, And Zach, on top of everything else, has been a halfback. He's a really accurate kicker, which sometimes the Irish players would kind of struggle with that. But they need to build it around a point of difference. Conor Nash is a guy, he just played 50 games. He broke 50 games this year, which again is a fairly considerable feat. But again, what he's bringing to that team is, apparently it's more so to do with his rugby background, I would argue, than his Gaelic football background. But, he's in the guts, in the midfield here is what I mean. He's throwing his body around, real strong presence. He's big and he's a really good tackler, but he's also got a lot of pace. So from contest to contest, he's there every single time, which is his point of difference. So when they're looking to an Irish player, it's not you actually nearly need to bring your threshold higher. It's not can you play an AFL game, it's can you bring us something different and play multiple AFL games. Is
it likely to become a little bit more difficult for Irish guys to get recruited? I mean, very clearly through the AFL's Europe Combine, they're still looking at players, and you say they're still scouring the market, but you're seeing players perhaps going into the AFL from slightly different backgrounds compared to before. They're now looking at college athletes in the United States. We're talking about maybe some guys who didn't make it into the NFL who are now being looked at as potential AFL players. As the net starts to spread a bit wider, will it become more difficult for Irish players to make it down there?
Maybe. I think the main obstacle right now is that the combine that used to come, as you mentioned there, used to come to Ireland every single year, was suspended because of COVID. So this combine is just a camp. They invite 20-25 guys up, invite list managers there. It's run by Kevin Sheehan, who's was a famous player for Geelong, is now the AFL international manager. He comes in. You get a couple of guys here based in Ireland to come in and just have a look at these players, and from that they pluck. So that's where Colin O'Riordan, for example, actually he came through the combine. Now, that's one element, a big element, but only one element of the scouting network. And there's employees right now in Ireland who are employed by clubs, and they are still scouting. And rest assured, it's going to come back up towards the end of this offseason. There will be players approach. It's my understanding there was a mini camp last year, which a couple of guys flew in for, a couple of under 20 stars were at that. The same thing will probably happen again this year. So this is just, I think a kicking sessions where they get these guys here, they get some scouts there. Some of the Irish boys who are, I think there's a couple of lads who are, their seasons are finished, are already on the way back. They'll probably invite it down and have a talk to the lads. So it's not going away. It's definitely not going away. There is still going to be clubs who will, might only be one or two. You look at a guy like Ulton Kellam, actually, who was supposed to go last year. He suffered a hip injury, so he was supposed to go to Fremantle last year. It didn't happen. They pushed it back a year. it's still on the cards that he goes this year. And if anybody who watched Fermanagh and someone who goes, he's good this year. Like, he's a phenomenal talent in itself. So I don't think it's, the biggest obstacle right now is definitely the combine. And partly then, you go to Australia, and because of COVID, really, you development manager were cut and soft caps were cut, so they don't have the same resources to actually do the scouting. But the clubs who have established networks here already will absolutely persist with it.
That brings around nicely to the amount of Irish women's players who've made the trip across. At this stage, 22, and retention even in Australia has improved for them, with keeping some of these players from not even coming back over. They've been getting set up with jobs over there so that they're in Australia 12 months a year. We know that the league continues to expand in the AFLW, and the season is going to expand in the not too distant future as well. This will bring more riches. It will also bring more demands probably in some of the players that went over. It's going to change, Maurice, I think, compared to when this was the initial stages, where some players went out to dip their toes for a few months, played a bit and came back and then played in the summer. Realistically, more and more players are probably going to find their way out to Australia now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Will, the really big thing is that when you look at the structure of the league, so I would say we're still kind of maybe in that sweet spot where players would just about manage it. But there's every year there's a collective bargaining agreement. So some of them last 3 years because of difficulty. The reason this, I'm sure you were the same, looking from Ireland and saying, when is the season actually going to start? Why haven't we got a start date? And the reason that was because they were doing the negotiations for the CBA. Eventually they managed to negotiate a deal, but it was only a 1 year deal. So at the end of this year, that's going to renegotiate it again. And it's my suspicion that the AFLPA the Players Association will strongly push for a full-time, as close to full-time as you will get. So you would have year-round contracts. And not, I think we're probably at the maximum in terms of the amount that the players can sacrifice, really, because you still have. I'm not talking about Irish players here now. I'm talking about because of Irish players, because of their visa requirements, they can't actually have part-time jobs, even though some of them actually would want to. But you still have Australians trying to balance work, trying to balance everything else in their lives on top of this contract. So that actually has a very obvious impact on the standard of play that we get on the field. So we're probably squeeze as much as we can out of that, and to take that next step, you would need it to see a full-time professional league, which I guess is what the hope we would get at the end of the CBA. And when that happens, then it's obvious that you can't do both. You can't get both. Now, on top of that, because you've got a steady stream of players, and you've got a national academy now, which is a couple of years up and running, that will inevitably start producing players, and it will level off. The need to look externally will level off, but it will never go away. Rest assured, there is already negotiations going on for players to go for some high-profile players to go next year. That's going to continue for at least the next couple of years, and then it might level off, but it'll never go away. This is the lay of the land now.
Yeah, Cora Staunton was saying to us a few weeks ago on the show that it's getting to a point now where the money is a little bit better and it is a little bit more attractive. So she was saying that this is going to be a big decision for a lot of players. I mean, even when you hear Vicky Wall saying after the All-Ireland final this year that she wants to be part of their drive for 3 in a row next year and will do everything possible to be back for Meath. Like, realistically, if she has a very good year, she might get a very lucrative offer for her potential second season to just stay in Australia for the calendar year.
Yeah, and some people might look at it and say, there's these certain tiers in their contract. So that the highest tier now, I think, is 70 grand, which is, these contracts have increased 94% since last year on average. But on top of that, then the clubs are very good for tying in, appearance-related fees for, a couple of days work in a shop. For a couple of the Irish players avail of that too. I think Vicky actually might be doing that in North Melbourne as well. So there's other ways as well that they will take care of you with relocation fees, with apartments, that sort of thing. So it's becoming a really. Previously, I think it was the allure of being a part of a professional environment and, being paid to play effectively, that you're getting access to all these incredible resources. And now on top of that, there is becoming increasingly a financial incentive.
Is the product improving as well, Maurice? Because we've had a few conversations around this, and Anthony Moyles was here a few weeks ago with me, and he was saying that he watched some of the women's final series this year, and he was saying he wasn't much of a fan of the standard of the product, and there was a few one-sided games that he was watching during the playoffs. Is the actual product on the pitch improving now?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think around stuff like this, Will, you have to be honest too, and there probably is an element of. I remember when I was in Australia and I had conversations with people about the media coverage of AFLW. I'm talking about players here now, and they would often say we probably have got to a stage where the colour pieces and the profiles are all really good. That's really strong. There probably isn't the interest in squads to do injury updates week on week. But what needs to happen next was my question, and they were saying it's a supplementary stuff. It's could we get like a fantasy league for AFLW, build interest that way? Could we get a documentary? It just so happens actually that there's a documentary I think it's out today on. I've only seen the first episode now, but I think it's out today on Disney, which an AFLW documentary. I would highly recommend that to people. Actually, by the way, there's an absolutely cracking scene in the first episode with Breathe Stack is asked to stand up and talk to the squad about how many All Irelands she has and how she won them. Again, to kind of prove why she's there to be a leader. So all that stuff, and on top of that as well, they're starting to talk about a bit of more critical analysis. Not just the superficial stuff. Like, can we really get into the nitty gritty of it? And I would say my biggest criticism of the AFLW over the last, maybe at least the last 2 years, is those mismatches. Like, there's teams who are miles apart. You look at some teams and their forward pressure is brilliant. Like, they're really good at pinning teams in. They're really, like, particularly some of the Melbourne teams. And then you look elsewhere and you don't see that level of play. And there is a real gulf there. And I think a lot of teams now, I know because this is an 18 team league now, but it's only 10 games in the season, so you won't play everybody. And I know the AFLW are very conscious of trying to split the game so you don't get these mismatches and everybody has a fairly even fixture list. But inevitably, right, because you've got 4 new teams, they're not going to be as good as the teams that are there, and you're going to get these one-sided games, and that doesn't do anybody any favours. So it has to be a priority really to get them up to level. But in a broader sense, I absolutely think their quality is improving. I think you really have seen teams, particularly some of the, as I mentioned, like I watched a lot of Melbourne last year. They, particularly teams like that, who really have made huge advancements. Tactically, their ball use is a lot better. You probably would have seen a lot of kind of ruck balls, ground play previously. That stuff is starting to really, really develop. I saw some cracking games last year.
I did wonder about the colour as well, because I think back about, the clip that went viral here of Breed Stack when she was called up to the list, and they kind of hidden the fact that she was going to be called up and she was the last name read out and everything. I wondered, did that resonate with the Australians in the same way that it probably resonated over here? Rest assured, like this, this is a league who are very conscious because of the competition within Australia, sporting wise. I mean, this is a league who are very good at selling itself, who are very conscious of the need to sell themselves. So they do those. I don't know if you saw the one today, for example, with North Melbourne with Erica O'Shea and Vicky Wall, but they really are good, really brilliant at making a big song and dance of this stuff, of selling it properly. The access, by all accounts, that documentary got is very good. So that kind of stuff, I think they are, and even just some of the journalists who cover AFLW are brilliant, and they do really great colour pieces. Now, as I say, you don't get the same ready stream of coverage because probably isn't the same rhythm as AFL, for example. It's a currency there, which is breaking news about this has gone wrong here, this player is going to looking for a contract here. The big one now is Buddy Franklin at Sydney Swans, who just a bit up in the air about his future. And this stuff was just people go hyperbolic on this sort of stuff, whereas you don't probably get the same stuff in AFLW because there's probably not the same recognition around names. So that element of coverage isn't there. But in terms of like features, colour, building it up, we'll get a couple of double headers this year, which I think is a great thing to see. Double headers as in AFLW and AFL, which I think is great to see. So from all that element, they nail it really. Yeah, it's amazing. The same arguments as we have here about double headers as well. Maurice, great to catch up as always. Thanks a million.
Thanks, Will.